Well, hello everyone. Welcome to the lesson on modern art. However, the term modern art cannot possibly cover all of the different styles that we'll be talking about in this lesson and in the next lesson. Art in the 20th century moved further away from representation as artists continued to explore new ways of expressing themselves. And as we learn the motivation and influences of these artists, their work can take on deeper meaning. This is such a broad topic and we can really only skim the surface, but we will look at some of the main influences of this time. So primarily we're going to be focusing on the first half of the 20th century in this lesson. And it was a time of great upheaval worldwide. We have 2 world wars, the rise of communism, fascism, and Nazism. And in addition, we have the Great Depression, which brought suffering to much of the world and caused overall instability. As often happens in times of social upheaval, the arts reflected this worldwide instability as the very foundations of social structures were called into question. Creative expression went through radical changes as artists questioned the true purpose of art and what is meant by the term a work of art. The painting to the left is a good example of this. It's by the artist Jean Metzinger, and he was an early advocate for a style that was called Cubism. One of the ways to understand this style of art is to imagine that you're looking at these objects from many sides at once. So from the top, from the bottom, from the right, from the left, all in one painting. And this really exemplifies how artists question the very premise of what made a successful work of art and what did not. However, before we go further into abstraction, I want to focus on the realism of the early 20th century. One of the things that I can see in students and that I've come across myself is a questioning of abstract art. So I encourage any of you who think, oh, I don't like that stuff, to be open to all of the styles. And I also want to encourage those of you who like realism that it was in the shadows, but it was also alive and well. There was a lot of realism and a moving the boundaries of realism that happened in the early 20th century. One example of this would be the artist Paul Cadmus. He was a realist painter who they called his style of art a magical realism. He actually painted a lot of social commentaries and sort of edgy paintings, but this one is a portrait that really demonstrates his expertise at the style of egg tempera. And as you'll remember, that means egg yolks in water with powdered pigment. So that's how this artist created these effects. He was a New York City artist. He was born to 2 parents who were both artists. And so it seemed natural that he would go to design school at a young age and carry on to be, he really helped carry the torch of realism in the early 20th century. Now another style of painting that was somewhat realistic was called the Ashcan School. And this painting of Gwendolyn to our left is a prime example of this style, painted by John Sloan. He was one of the founders of the school. Now the Ashcan School had a sort of a secondary purpose. And that was to document the conditions and the dignity of the people who were living in the inner cities at this time. Primarily, these artists focused on New York City. So let's look at one more by John Sloan. And you might want to look up the Ashcan School to see a whole host of a kind of a stylized artwork of the early 20th century. This is his Sunset on West 23rd Street, painted in the early 1905, and you can clearly see the loosening of the influences of the Impressionists. Another style of art that emerged at this time was surrealism, which means simply super realism. And these artists explored the unconscious mind in a variety of ways. They would do automatic writing. They would just sit down to paint without really considering ahead of time what they were going to paint. This one I find particularly interesting because it was painted before the Surrealist movement and was sort of an example for these artists. And it's called The Mystery and Melancholy of a Street by Giorgio Charico. And he was This one was painted prior to World War I, just as it was about to sweep through Europe, followed by the pandemic, which was going to really disrupt society going forward. And in this painting, we can see the premonition of danger. He could never explain why he painted this and what it meant. But here we have an empty moving van, a girl running with a hoop, and this ominous shadow in the background here. What does it mean? After the war, Chirico returned to Italy, and he dismissed these earlier symbolic works as if they were embarrassing or silly, and he returned to painting in a more conservative style. Yet this painting remains as a seminal work of the Surrealist painters. They believed in the power of dreams, the unconscious mind, and the writings of Sigmund Freud were a strong influence as they were becoming popularized at the same time. So one of the more famous Surrealist artists is this one, Salvador Dali. So let's look at the influences of what became the Surrealist movement. As World War I came to a close, followed by the flu epidemic, these young artists began to call into question the very fundamentals of art. You can probably imagine, especially at this time, that if all of your dreams and ideas about what the future would look like were blown apart, that might lead to a deeper questioning. And that's what happened with these artists. There was a group called the Dadaists, or Dada, comprised of artists who sought to push the societal limits and really kind of push people's buttons on what was art and what was not. The term Dada simply means nonsensical baby talk. One famous Dada sculpture presented by Marcel Duchamp was a porcelain urinal. I think it was new, and it had "R. Mutt" written on it as sort of sideways. It looks like it's written with fingernail polish. And this was presented as a work of art in a fine gallery, and it really outraged the art establishment. So the Dadaists continue to do this kind of work that pushed the boundaries and often leaves us scratching our heads. But as this faded, as this very radical expression faded, the same group moved to an exploration of the unconscious mind. They believed that if art bypassed the conscious mind, then one could go directly from the unconscious mind to the canvas. And they did a lot of practices to encourage this. They wanted to create art that was, quote, free from the exercise of reason and from any aesthetic or moral purpose. Now let's think about the futurists, which we're going to be talking about in a moment, who had the absolute opposite idea. On the one hand, we have the Surrealists, who denied the power of the rational mind, who believed that the strength in art came from accessing the unconscious irrational. And at the same time, we have other groups of artists who were purely dedicated to the rational mind and believed that that would be the answer to pretty much all society's ills. Now, this is something that we've seen actually throughout history. So here it is happening again. This pattern of rational versus irrational, of logic versus, you could say, intuition, this has happened in humanity since the earliest times. We see it in the Greeks, and the Romans, and the Renaissance, and here it is again in early 20th century art. The painting on the left, The Persistence of Memory, is one of the most famous Surrealist paintings by one of the most famous artists, Salvador Dali. And if you study his life, he lived it like a Surrealist painting. And there's all sorts of archival footage of him making very bizarre films and other images as he sought to live out this philosophy on a daily basis. The painting on the right is a self-portrait of Frida Kahlo, and she was a Mexican artist who was married to a muralist. And the story of her life is quite fascinating, and we'll have a film about that this week. The short story is she had a lot of challenges in her life, and her work is primarily a depiction of herself, of self-portraits. So let's look at Marc Chagall. He was an artist who was a Russian Jew, and he emigrated from Russia just before the First World War. In the painting I and the Village, he's depicting all these memories from his childhood and bringing in scenes from Russian folk tales and symbols from his unconscious mind. The Bride with Fan below shows a simpler style and his really beautiful execution, I feel. His use of colors and use of paint is really creates a kind of a magical feeling. So a really different surrealist, who I happen to really like, one of many, is René Magritte. He was an important artist at the time. He didn't go so much for deep philosophical statements. Apparently, anyway, he sought instead to just depict the absurd. His work uses images that upset our whole ideal of how the world works, and this was exactly what he had in mind. He wanted to discredit ordinary reality and replace it with imagery that led the viewers to what he called the world's mystery. These two examples are only a taste of the huge body of work that he created in his lifetime. One of his more famous images is this one, and it is called simply, "This is not a pipe." I really like this image because it brings right into the foreground the main point behind abstract art. And that is that a painting is a painting. Pigment on canvas will always be pigment on canvas. And if you try to make this be a pipe, you will never succeed fully. So artists took that one step further and moved further and further away from realistic paintings. One of the most widely known artists who moved from realism to abstraction would be Pablo Picasso. He was one of the best known and most productive artists of the 20th century. Picasso was born in 1881 in southern Spain. He was the son of an accomplished artist and art teacher. His family moved to Barcelona when Pablo was 15 so that he could develop his artistic gifts. This painting on the left was painted when Pablo Picasso was only 15, and the figure on the right when he was 49. So you can see the evolution or devolution of his style as he moved away from realism. However, with Picasso, there's a really good reason that I can see that he did that. Having mastered art at such an early age, where could he go but away from realism? He was the son of an art professor and a child prodigy in painting. Under his father's instruction, he mastered the academic techniques at a very young age. By the time he reached his late teens, he seemed bored by the academic methods, and he inspired to explore other creative endeavors. And on this pursuit, he left Spain at the age of 19 to explore the avant-garde art scene in Paris. And it was here that he was strongly influenced by the work of the post-impressionist artists. This picture on the left is of an art dealer, and it was painted by Picasso when he was just 20 years old. Throughout his life, Picasso continued to experiment. He continued to have wild ideas and to complete them. And that was really probably the secret to his longevity. This middle painting, so this was painted when he was 20. This one was painted just 5 years later. And to the right is a painting called The Frugal Repast. And this was painted during a time when he was hungry, when he had just arrived in Paris and he was struggling. This was during what is known as Picasso's blue period. And you can really see cold, hunger, and probably not quite enough money during this period of life. And that was the reality of what the artist was living. His work was well received in Paris, but he was not content to rest on his successes. In 1907, Picasso embarked in a revolutionary new direction called Cubism. Here we have La Demoiselle d'Avignon, which was his first effort. In this painting, Picasso's fascination with primitive art is obvious. He has broken up the planes into extremely simple shapes. While it is confusing to the eye, the artist meticulously planned this work. There's supposed to be women at a brothel, and originally there were 2 male figures also included, but they got the axe. somewhere in the long process of designing this painting. And while it looks haphazard, what he's trying to do is explore the picture plane. Can we show one image from many different angles in different styles? It's like turning it into a multifaceted image rather than a flat image. When it was first shown, the critics and the viewing public were shocked. One critic said it resembled a field of broken glass. And they insulted this kind of work by calling it cubism. And naturally, as artists have done throughout history, they took this insult and they took it as the name of this new style of art. So at first, Picasso's peers scoffed at his early Cubist efforts. But before too long, they were creating their own Cubist paintings. This one on the left, Nude Descending a Staircase, is by Marcel Duchamp. And remember, he's the same Dada artist who made the urinal and put it in a gallery as art. This is actually considered to be the quintessential Cubist painting. Often people who don't get at all what they're trying to do with Cubism can kind of understand it by looking at this one. So imagine someone is coming down a staircase, and we're seeing the whole trip down the staircase in one painting. It brings to mind a deeper questioning of what is reality and how we view reality. The painting on the right is by George Braque, and he was a friend of Picasso's and a co-founder of the Cubist school. At first he scoffed at it, but then he got quite interested. So this one is called Violin and Palette. And when you look at the violin, you can see that it's chopped up and sort of put back together, as is typical in Cubism. So let's move from Cubism to Futurism. Now the Futurists are an interesting group because they have some ideals that could be considered wholesome and healthy, and others that were quite dangerous and contributed to World War I and World War II. They emerged also from this time when everything was called into question. And the Futurists believed that the faster pace of life had fundamentally altered humankind, that this was a positive development, and that a whole new approach to life was needed. The Futurist artists created art that reflected the high speeds now possible for humans. Here we can see one on the right by Alberto Bucciano, and he was a primary futurist. He was one of the main ones. There was another futurist philosopher named Filippo Marinetti, and he wrote a manifesto which included the following passage: that we will glorify war, the only true hygiene of the world, that we will destroy museums and fight against all utilitarian cowardice. So unfortunately, these thoughts were an inspiration for Italian fascism, and they inspired Mussolini prior to World War II. So I ask you to recall, when we were talking about surrealism and the unconscious mind, I referred to another kind of art that would be more focused on the conscious mind, on rational thought as the answer to all of humanity's troubles. Well, here we have it with the Futurists and Pierre Mondrian. Pierre Mondrian was a Dutch artist, and he was strongly influenced by the Cubists. You can see here it's pretty much all cube and no realism. He founded a movement called Das Stil, or the style, and believed that there were two kinds of beauty: a sensual, emotional, or subjective kind, and another kind of beauty that was a higher beauty that was based on rational thought. It was universal and objective, and it was independent of emotional influences. This makes me think of Plato and Aristotle, and Plato's writings on how terrible emotions were, where, my theory is that it's a balance of both. However, let's go back to Mondrian. His style can be linked to the Bauhaus school, which we're going to look at in the next slide. He attempted to make purely rational art, eliminating any images that represented objects. He didn't like curves because they had a sensual association. Mondrian was convinced that nature, with its irregularity, was the source of humanity's distress, and he avoided going outdoors, living in a very Spartan apartment. There are stories about him that he would go out to eat and he would ask to face away from the window so he didn't have to look at the messiness outside. And that when he walked, he was very careful to stay on the pavement, so he did not have to touch grass. So there you go. There's one way to live in the world. And on that same theme, let's talk about the Bauhaus. So the founder of the school was a man named Walter Gropius, and he wanted to reconcile modern art and industry through what he called a cultural synthesis. Now, he built his school on this belief that an ideal world would be run by rational thought alone. The Bauhaus artists were trained in every aspect of their craft, which is a pretty interesting way of looking at it. The architect would have built a house, so ideally he would understand every aspect of the building process before creating a plan. Now, having worked around construction, I think this is such a great idea, because an architect can draw anything, but can a builder always build what the architect draws? What if the architect had first built a house and had learned every aspect? Now, this might not be practical, but it seems like an effective way of training in any field. Walter Gropius, hey, remember his name. He founded the Bauhaus. Walter Gropius. His School of Arts and Crafts taught streamlined design principles, and they employed many avant-garde artists. Here's the building pictured above, and you can see here how this kind of architecture really influenced architectural design into the 1960s. Now, unfortunately, in 1933, Adolf Hitler closed the school, and many of the artists fled to the United States. There's a little bit more of the Bauhaus, and we'll see it in Miles van der Rohe and in some other architects that we'll be looking at in the next lesson. Both of these images depict the design elements of Bauhaus. So the interior, you can see there is absolutely nothing that does not need to be there. For me personally, I find it a little bit cold, but we all have our tastes. And this is a factory building that's almost all glass. So that was another innovation of the Bauhaus movement. Hey, let's take a short trip into sculpture. One of the most influential artists of the 20th century was the sculptor Henry Moore. His career spanned 7 decades, and this is an early work, his reclining figure, made in 1929. In this image, Moore is paying homage to the earlier classic work and to the tribal work of Mesoamerica. This figure is based on a sculpture from the frieze of the Parthenon in Athens, Greece, but he has depicted it in a style that looks more like the Mesoamerican art that we see in the temples of Central America. So Constantine Brancusi was another artist of this time that was very influential. He was from Romania, and his work, in his work, he sought to create work that moved beyond the surface. He wanted to look into the essence or the spirit of the objects that he sculpted. And I really am a fan of his primarily because he always had these dogs. And he seemed very fond of his dogs, but that's my bias. Brancusi's most famous sculpture is the Kiss on the right. And here you can see, you can maybe get the idea of when he says he wants to get down to the essential nature of a form. The head of a woman on the left does the same thing. Another really well-known, important sculptor of the time was Barbara Hepworth. And she was a woman in a man's world, but she managed to make a mark nonetheless. She was British, and she really developed her own style of abstract sculpture. I can't help but think that it was, maybe it looks a little more feminine in nature. Well, she was the first person to emphasize a void or a hole in her sculptures, which inspired other artists to continue this exploration. That's considered her great contribution to the world of abstract sculpture, was to simply have a hole in the middle. Funny all the faces that innovation can take. So we'll move on from Barbara Hepworth's aesthetic innovation to talk about a less favorable innovation, and that would be the onset of saturation bombing. Picasso began to paint images that reflected his despair at the violence that seemed to be increasing in Europe during the 1930s. In the spring of 1937, the town of Guernica, which was the ancient capital of the Basque people, was bombed by the Nazis as a practice for a new technique of saturation bombing. Now, as a result of this bombing practice, thousands of innocent civilians were killed. Picasso painted this in 1938. It's 11 feet, 6 inches high, and over 25.5 feet long. And this was his reaction to the violence of war and the slaughter of innocent civilians. In the years after it was painted, this saturation bombing that started at Guernica would become a standard practice of the Nazis. When it was originally completed, this painting had to be smuggled out of France. It had been painted, for the 1938 Paris Expo, but it was so explosive and so controversial that it was hidden for many years in New York. I like to imagine this huge painting rolled up and hidden away somewhere till it was safe to display it. So as abstraction was becoming a primary movement in the cities, there was a parallel movement called regionalism, and this was in response or protest to the urbanization of American life and to the dissolving of realism into abstraction. As the cities grew, people began to romanticize the rural life that was rapidly diminishing. The Ozark artist Thomas Hart Benton was a well-known regionalist painter. He was born in Neosho, Missouri in 1989, and he attended the Art Institute of Chicago. Benton returned to the Ozarks in the 1920s, and he painted scenes of the common people, executing a number of murals as part of the WPA program. You can see some of these murals in the Missouri State Capitol. This is another favorite artist of mine, and one of the things that I like about his work is that he stays with realism, but you can also see the influences of the changes in art that have happened in the previous half of the century. So this one on the right is called The Ballad of the Jealous Lover of Big Green Valley. And I like it because here we have the musicians, and here we have the guy with the knife and the woman and somebody hiding behind a tree. So it's all, the song is playing itself out in the painting. He had what he called the hollow in the bump, which is a design tool that he used throughout his painting career. Another artist of the time is the artist Georgia O'Keeffe, and she was a woman in a man's world, really. She had a strong spirit, which made her a force to be reckoned with in the art world of the early 1900s. She was married to the photographer Alfred Stieglitz, and he photographed her throughout her life. So this has left us with a wealth of images documenting her life. The one on the right, however, wouldn't have been taken by Stieglitz because he never went to her New Mexico home. Throughout her life, she would spend her summers in New Mexico and her winters in New York City, painting out in the desert and taking them home to sell in New York. She lived to be in her 90s, so we have a lot of work from this artist. I like to compare these two images. And again, when we look at artists whose work can be less representational, sometimes it's fun to see that they can do purely representational work. The one on the left is called Banana Flower. The one on the right is the Radiator Building in New York City. Now, she did say that of this painting, she just started at one corner of the canvas and painted with no thought ahead of time. Although I find that hard to imagine in looking at this composition because it is so well balanced. Her husband, Alfred Stieglitz, believed that photography could be used as an art form beyond its role as a documentation. Here we have some of his artistic photographs, Spring Showers and The Steerage, which is his most famous work. The picture of the horse in the middle I just thought was a really interesting artist's view, to see a strong composition really wherever the artist looks. We will end this slideshow by looking at the work of an American realist artist whose work spans much of the 20th century. This is a famous painting called The Nighthawks, painted by Edward Hopper in 1942. Now, Hopper's work is really interesting because no matter what he paints, it has a desolate feel to it. We can look at how he uses space and shadow and light to always bring in a quality of the loneliness of the human condition. It's really interesting that even the simplest scene takes on a feeling of starkness. Here in this famous simple painting, we see the lonely city life late at night. And when you think about this, was just when the United States was going into World War II, there is a feeling of a certain kind of dread. Maybe I'm reading that into it. But with this slide, we're going to wrap up part 1 of Modern 1, and we'll continue in the next lesson to explore this really interesting and varied time in art. Hey, thanks for listening.